Thank you all for joining us for today's webinar on the required DOT and OSHA training for motor carriers and drivers. There's a lot that we're going to be covering in today's webinar, including entry-level driver training, from drug and alcohol driver training, long combination vehicles training, OSHA workplace safety training, and safety transportation of human and animal food rule training, and all the requirements involved for those trainings. Our speaker today is the training wizard, John Sallak. He's going to be diving into these details of all the requirements. If you don't know John Sallak already, he worked 23 years from a dispatcher to operations manager. Later, John became the director of safety for the Oregon Trucking Associations and has conducted seminars and performed compliance reviews for member fleets in Oregon, across the United States, and parts of Canada. So his wealth of knowledge is incredibly vast, and we're excited to have him here today. Before we begin, a couple webinar housekeeping items. This webinar is scheduled for an hour. Phones will be muted during the webinar, so please, if you have any questions, submit them in the chat box. I, Luke Kibbe, your moderator today, will keep an eye on them, and we'll have a Q&A session at the end to answer any of those questions. If we run long, we will email questions and answers out after the webinar. And lastly, the webinar is being recorded. After the presentation today, you should expect in your email box tomorrow morning the presentation slides, link of the recording of the webinar, and again, if there's any Q&A session stuff that we need to do via email, we'll provide it in that email tomorrow morning. With that, let's go ahead and dive in. We're going to pass it off to John Sallak. John, go ahead and take it away.
Okay, thank you, Luke, very much for the glowing praise. Now I have to try and live up to it somehow. We're going to cover a lot of material in a very short amount of time. There's so much training material that has to be adhered to when we're subject to these federal safety regulations, subject to the OSHA rules, subject to the Food Safety Management Act. All of these connect to the fact that we're in business with commercial motor vehicles, hauling property and sometimes hauling passengers. Throughout the slides, you'll notice that there is a rule number attached to each slide, which refers to that training requirement. So when we're finished, as I said, we'll be going quickly through some of these without a lot of time for great detail. But you can go to those points on the internet and take a look at those rules if you need a little more detail. And I would also mention that here at Glowstone, if there's something that we cover in the next hour or so that is possibly something that you need to accomplish and haven't accomplished for your drivers yet, then please contact Glowstone, because they may well have the training material or a training person that can serve you and help you to stay in compliance on these issues. So to start out, why do we even do this? Well, I would hope all of you will agree with these three premises. First, we have an obligation when we're operating with commercial motor vehicles to do no harm, the same as the doctor's code. We want to prevent illnesses, injuries, fatalities that may occur because of our operation up and down the highway. Second, we want to protect the company's assets. Profit is not a dirty word. In most cases, we're out there in business trying to generate a profit for the owners, for those who took the risk to start the business. So profits are important, and sometimes profits are very small. After we've paid all of the bills, covered all of the expenses, there should be some left, and that's called profit, and that's good. That's what keeps companies healthy. From that money that's left after we paid all the bills, we may have penalties to pay to the DOT, to the Department of Labor, to the Food and Drug Administration, because we failed to do some required training. That is just wasted money. We do not want to be spending our money that we worked so hard to earn paying somebody's penalties. And the third item, the third that's extremely important, is we want to avoid litigation. Plaintiff attorneys and jury trials will target our training records and the quality of our training if we find ourselves in litigation. And I have to tell you, from the years I've spent in the trucking industry, one of the weaker areas we have in trucking, and it's universal, is that we're not always good trainers and we don't always keep good records of the training. And whatever you do, if you're training, you must document it and must document it carefully. If it wasn't written down, it didn't happen when the time comes that we have to defend ourselves in court. So I hope you all agree. Those are 3 good reasons for us to be on top of the training requirements that we're going to talk about. Now, to lead up to it, I need to give you my little 25-cent civics lesson. We're a nation of laws and rules. The laws come to us through Congress or our state legislature. A bill gets introduced, it goes through committee hearings, and if it's continued to be voted in favor, then it will eventually come out to the House and the Senate. If they pass it, it'll be signed and go into law. Either the president or a state governor will sign it, and it becomes law or statute. We're talking today about regulations or rules. They come to us through a department of government that has rulemaking authority. A rule will be proposed by that agency and then published in the Federal Register or in a state public document. There will be a 60-day period for public comment, and you and I can comment on any rule that's ever published for a proposal. After the comment period has ended, a final rule will be published, and it becomes part of the Code of Federal Regulations, in some cases a state regulatory code. Quite often, with the material we'll talk about today, the states have adopted the federal regulations, and we'll be looking at federal regulations. But the states adopt them, and then they become enforced by civil or criminal penalties, either one. So the Code of Federal Regulations, the term CFR, and you'll get familiar with this as we go through. There are 50 departments of federal government, and each is assigned a title number for the Code of Federal Regulations. For example, the Department of Transportation, where we'll spend time today, is Title 49. The Department of Labor, when we talk about OSHA, Title 29. And the Department of Agriculture, Title 7. Environmental Protection Agency, Title 40, and there are 50 of them out there. When we cite a regulation, the citation will typically look like this. And the reason we want to give this to you is that if you have a rule number, you can go online and search for it and find the text for that particular rule very easily. So there's an example where we might be talking about driver's logs and driver's hours of service. If you wanted to find that particular rule and you searched for 49 CFR Part 395.1, it would take you to the exact rule that might give you the answer you seek. So enough about the civics lesson. That's how we use these regulations. And we'll go into now first the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, and that's a part of the U.S. Department of Transportation, and it is Title 49. And there are several training requirements in that area. To decide whether or not we're even subject to the rules, we have to know how they apply and to whom they apply. So the regulations here apply to commercial motor vehicles operating in interstate commerce carrying property or passengers. As I mentioned earlier, most states will adopt all of these rules for intrastate. But we're talking about interstate commerce. Most states will cover the same thing in intrastate. So what is a commercial vehicle? It's any single vehicle or a combination with a gross vehicle weight rating. That's the rating assigned by the factory that exceeds 10,000 pounds. The following slides refer to training that is mandated by the DOT because the company is transporting property or passengers in a commercial vehicle, which would be a gross vehicle weight rating over 10,000 pounds. There are a couple of times when we will mention a different rating and a different definition of a commercial vehicle. But for now, keep that in mind. I believe we have some folks on the line who might be in the construction industry, and they might have pickup trucks that will certainly not rate at 10,000 plus pounds. However, if that pickup is hooked to a trailer to move some material, that combination may exceed 10,000 pounds. That driver, therefore, is subject to the regulations, and the company is subject to the training requirements that we're about to cover. A long combination vehicle is a term that came about back in 2004. And while we're here, I'd just like to refer you to the part number that's at the very top of the screen. Part 380.101 to 380.401 covers the requirements for training for long combination vehicles. So an LCV, long combination vehicle, is a combination with two or more trailers, and the gross vehicle weight, the actual weight, exceeds 80,000 pounds. Now, the rule typically is considered to apply to freight or van type trailers, or maybe even flatbeds. Two trailers, maybe three trailers, and the gross weight is over 80,000. We need to encourage you, if you're involved in any kind of construction or heavy haul, if you have a lowboy type trailer and you need to add axles with a booster or a Jeep, that combination becomes an LCV. And if you have one of those in your fleet and you're adding axles, you've also added a second point of articulation, and you therefore have a double. And it's over 80,000 pounds, so you have to have this training. The training consists of two modes. First, classroom training. And this can be taught by anyone with knowledge of the classroom curriculum. This is a point where not too many folks have gone out to develop any training material because there weren't that many drivers who needed it. We do have access to LCV training material for the classroom. And if you've made yourself familiar with the presentation, then you're a certified trainer. The second type of training is called skills training, and this is behind the wheel, and it must be done for every driver of an LCV. The trainer must have at least 2 years experience, driving LCVs. An LCV driver student must have doubles and triples endorsement on the commercial driver license and must also have 6 months experience driving doubles or triples that are not LCVs. In other words, the student has to have 6 months of experience pulling 2 trailers or 3 trailers, but they do not exceed 80,000 pounds. So that's LCV training. It's something that's been around since 2004, and we're learning that a lot of companies, especially with heavy haul, are not aware of the rule or haven't done the training. Here in Oregon, which we operate, we're seeing local enforcement becoming heavier on the LCV training rule. Another requirement is for an entry-level driver. Now, the entry-level driver is one who has held a CDL for less than 1 year. At this point, I need to mention something to you. We talked about the 10,001 pound weight threshold for a commercial vehicle. There are some exceptions where we're only dealing with a CDL driver and a CDL vehicle. That weight threshold is 26,001 pounds. And in some cases, we'll talk about training that's only required for the driver who's operating a CDL vehicle. The CDL entry-level driver is one who's had the CDL for less than a year, and they have to have classroom training on 4 different subjects. One is driver qualification. Another is driver's hours of service. These are both in the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations. They also have to have some training on health and wellness. As you may know, we have some serious health issues in the trucking industry. We've got an industry that requires long hours at times, some pretty heavy levels of stress and heavy traffic and that type of thing, and sometimes results in very poor eating and exercising conditions. We wind up with drivers on the road, diabetes, obesity, sleep apnea, things, and blood pressure, things that happen because of the lifestyle sometimes. So the DOT wants us to share some information on nutrition and exercise with that brand new driver. The last piece is the OSHA whistleblower law, and that has to be shared with an entry-level driver. And it simply is a law from the Department of Labor that says if you feel your safety has been compromised in the workplace, then you're entitled to file a complaint with OSHA and not be punished for it. No repercussion for actually being the whistleblower. So this material must be covered if you have a driver who has had the CDL for less than a year. Now, there's a rulemaking in progress right now that would expand this training to where it would be an awful lot more, a lot of time behind the wheel included, and that training will be coming along in the year 2020. So watch closely. If you have access to Glowstone's information and their newsletters, you'll be sure to see it as time approaches for entry-level driver training. CDL drivers are subject to drug and alcohol testing under various situations. In order for the supervisor to be able to make a decision about testing someone because there's reasonable suspicion or reasonable cause, in order for the supervisor to be able to do that, they must have specific training. That training deals with controlled substance and alcohol testing who are operating CDL vehicles, and this training will teach that supervisor how to recognize symptoms and effects of controlled substances use and abuse, and also the effects of alcohol use and abuse. The training should cover 2 hours, 60 minutes on drugs, 60 minutes on alcohol. It's a one-time requirement. It's not required to be recurrent anywhere. But it's very important for the supervisor to have this information and this training. Now, there's no training for truck drivers that's required right now on drug and alcohol awareness. However, there is a requirement that you give every CDL driver a written drug and alcohol testing policy that includes recognizing symptoms and effects of drugs and alcohol. So the truck driver has to have something either through your policy or as an addendum, so they also will know how to recognize someone who may be struggling or misusing drugs or alcohol. The fact is, in almost any trucking operation, if somebody's abusing a drug or abusing alcohol, the first person to know will probably be a co-worker, another driver, not the supervisor. So that's the purpose of giving the drivers some material also. Now we're talking about everybody, not just the CDL driver. There's a requirement that says every employer must be knowledgeable of and comply with the regulations. This could be the HR department, operations people, the safety director, maintenance personnel, anyone who might be involved with commercial vehicles must be knowledgeable of all of the regulations that apply. This infers, although they don't use the word training, this infers that all these folks who are probably managers, shop foremen, safety directors, all need to have some training on all of the rules that apply. In addition, every commercial vehicle driver must be trained on the applicable regulations. So that would pretty much infer that every driver should be trained on driver qualification, drug and alcohol testing, driver's hours of service, inspections, repair, maintenance, a lot of training. Now, a lot of folks do this by handing every driver a copy of the regulations, a pocket version of the federal safety regulations. The driver signs a receipt, and at that point, he or she is considered trained. We put the receipt in the file, and that's the end of it. I would encourage you to conduct formal training on each of the major parts of the regulations and have a record of that training. The fact that we've given the driver a book and the driver signed a receipt, I can promise you will not hold up for proper training if you're ever in court. Frequently in the trucking industry, we're transporting regulated hazardous materials. Now, a hazardous material is defined as any product that when it's transported would cause an unreasonable risk to people, property, and the environment. When a property is regulated and someone is going to ship or load or unload or transport that product, they must have training on the hazardous materials regulations. The training is recurrent every 3 years, and we have to cover 4 areas. General awareness. General awareness means talking about all of the ways with which we communicate risk when we're transporting. Placards, labels, markings, shipping papers, bills of lading. We have to talk about security because quite often we're transporting something that might be of interest to someone who wants to do harm to us. And then we have to train on function-specific material, which would be the exact job that that person is expected to perform. For example, in the classroom, we might be able to cover an awful lot of this, but we can't teach the driver who's going to transport gasoline how to load and unload. That would be function-specific training learned in orientation and on the job. And then we also have to train on the safety rules that apply to hazardous materials. All of this material, and then it has to be done every 3 years. Some hazardous materials pose a unique high risk, explosives maybe, flammables, poisons, radioactive material. If they carry these kinds of products in certain quantities that would pose a terrorist risk, there must be a written security plan. The plan is in great detail, and there's a lot of information out on the internet about how to write the plan. Glowstone can help you also. Hazardous materials employees whose company must have a plan must be trained in depth on the written plan, and they must be trained every 3 years. And the plan must be kept confidential. Things will be covered like unauthorized access to your property, teaching the drivers how to act in transit, how to protect themselves and the load in transit. So those are the major training requirements in the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations. And if you are audited by a representative of the DOT, you could be asked for any or all of those training records. We're going to go into a new Department of Government now, and that's the Department of Labor. And under the Department of Labor, Title 29 is OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. OSHA is charged for making sure that employers have a safe workplace, that we prevent injuries, we prevent illness. So these are some training requirements that may or may not apply to you, depending on the type of business you're in. And of course, we don't know that from here. But as you go through these, think about them. Is this something I need to be doing in my company? There's a requirement for safety committees, and I am referring here not to the federal code, but to the Oregon code, partly because we're based here and partly because Oregon has had a leading role in establishing very good rules for safety committees. And in fact, if you ever need some written material, we could certainly provide that to you through Oregon OSHA. If you have more than 10 employees, you're required to have a safety committee. The committee members have to be trained on the rules of how to conduct the meetings and inspections. There's quite a bit to it. You have to have a prearranged agenda for the meeting. Members have to represent all phases of the business. So in a trucking company, maybe a 15 or 20 truck operation, you should probably have a mechanic, maybe someone in the office, a driver, and maybe a guest speaker or a guest visitor, someone at different times. But you need to have some regular members. If you have more than 10 employees, you should have at least 2 on the committee. More than 20, you should have at least 4 people. And all this is a plan on how to investigate, inspect, and prevent injuries and illnesses in our workplace. A lot of material to go with it, but you have to have the meeting, you follow the agenda, and then you post the results. And if someone has brought up a safety issue, that has to be addressed and has to be corrected. When that has been done, then you also post the correction. Safety committees. And I would encourage you to get some folks who are inspired to really want to do a good job on this committee. You need volunteers. If someone's forced to be on the committee, you may not get the greatest attitude and the greatest participation from them. But we've seen over the years, time and time again, where issues have been brought up by an employee to the safety committee, the issue was dealt with, the problem was corrected, and injuries were avoided. Hazard communication, and this gets to be a little bit of confusion here in our world of training and safety, because we've just talked about hazardous materials. Hazardous materials are those that are transported and they present a risk to people, property, and the environment. Hazard communication is from OSHA, and it deals with any hazardous chemical that's in the workplace that an employee might be exposed to. Not all hazardous chemicals are hazardous materials. So all hazardous chemicals, those employees have to be trained, and they have to be trained in the term hazard communication. We need to explain to the employee what is present in the workplace and what are the risks and how do we deal with them. So one of the major parts of it would be to list the chemicals that are currently present in the workplace. We would have to have a written hazard communication program. A big part of it is training people on how to use safety data sheets. And they're very simple to understand with a little bit of training. The safety data sheets are critical. And then about 2 or 3 years ago, we started seeing a change in the hazard communication training standard, and we were working toward what's called global harmonization, some uniformity in the training. And pictograms and certain labels were introduced into the training program. All of these things combined become your hazard communication training program, and it's a classroom session that can be held. The amount of chemical, the number of employees will all dictate how long this class should take. It should be repeated when new chemicals are introduced to the workplace or new hazards. One of the things that we've seen over the years in the trucking industry is people are really good about doing this HazCom training with manufacturing, in warehouses, and in maintenance shops, particularly, because there's so many chemicals, but they don't train their truck drivers. Truck drivers under the OSHA standard must also be trained on hazard communication. And some folks think that they're not really exposed to these chemicals, but if you watch the truck driver doing his or her job during the day, the first thing they should be doing is checking fluids. So they're exposed to motor oil, diesel fuel, antifreeze, different types of fluids that are involved just in running the truck. So there are chemical exposures. If they're spending any time in the maintenance shop, they're exposed to other chemicals there. So all should be trained on hazard communication. As a requirement, it's little known, but it's in the OSHA standard in Part 1904, and that's that someone who's responsible for recording accidents and illnesses needs to be trained on recording processes. If you're responsible for reporting accidents and illnesses, and that might be the same person, there's also a training requirement, and that's laid out in Part 1904. Something that may or may not be required in your industry, and this is where you need to read the standard carefully and see if it would apply to you. But whenever an OSHA standard mandates emergency action plans, you need to develop the plan and then train on it. Now, this would be possibly a situation where there's a pretty large risk of fire or explosion or a health risk, maybe air quality. There has to be a procedure for rescue and medical duties if someone has been affected, and there has to be a procedure for evacuation and then for accounting for all the persons after the evacuation. A very important plan and training that you need to decide whether or not that's going to be a requirement for you, and you should have it in place if you should be visited by OSHA. Fire extinguishers. This may sound a little silly, but OSHA standard says that we have to train our employees on the safe and effective operation of a portable fire extinguisher. In fact, we've seen times when people did not know how to operate the extinguisher and how to work properly, and they aim the product at the top of the flames. Well, aiming this product at the top of the flames does nothing to control the fuel that's causing the fire. You have to go to the base of the flames. This training is required annually and should be documented carefully, but quite often we see that this has never been done. And this is something that you might also want to include family members. If you have fire extinguishers in your home, get the training material and conduct it on your own at home and make sure your family members know that this is something that's very important, and they may need to someday take that extinguisher out of the rack and point and shoot, and they need to know how to do that. One of the greatest resources for this, and it's usually free, is to go to your local fire department. And the firemen enjoy presenting these at schools, and they'll come, in most cases, they'll come to your workplace and conduct the training for you. Or they can give you a setup information on how you can do your own training. But please take care of this, because we never know when we may have to use a fire extinguisher. If we've never touched one, we could be in some trouble just trying to get it to operate. In some cases, the OSHA standard will say that you have to have a fire prevention plan. And this is pretty elaborate, more than just a basic safety plan. You have to list all of the major fire hazards that are in the workplace. And you have to be prepared to conduct proper handling and storage for the hazardous materials. And you have to document and train on the type of fire protection equipment that's available. To deal with this, if you decide that your company should have a fire prevention plan, your local fire marshal or the fire marshal's office can certainly help you here to develop a good plan, and probably they could even provide some training material or on-site training for you. Lockout, tagout. I think almost every truck shop, every truck maintenance shop will have a requirement for lockout, tagout devices, which means that those people who might be called on to service or maintain a machine or repair a machine would have to have lockout, tagout training. And this is dealing with machines and equipment that have stored energy. A good example of this would be an air compressor, and the stored energy is air. You might have one of the stored fluids of some sort under pressure, but you need to identify those sources of stored energy. If you have to work with that machinery or that piece of equipment, you need to either disengage, eliminate that stored energy, or lock out or tag out the device so no one will come to it and try and use it. Sometimes lockout will be enough, sometimes tag out will also be required. Lockout, tagout, in our experience, is one of the things that frequently is missed in training our technicians in our truck maintenance shops. HAZWOPER is a term that a lot of people hear and maybe don't understand exactly what it is. Sometimes here at Glowstone, we'll get a call from someone who says, I have to have HAZWOPER training. They may not actually need it all. So this is a little bit about HAZWOPER. It's an acronym for Hazardous Waste Operation and Emergency Response. So by the title, we're dealing with hazardous waste materials. Now, when you go into this rule number, 1910.120, it's a long rule. You better get a cup of coffee and get comfortable if you want to read through the whole thing. It covers several levels of training, dependent on the responsibility of the person for cleanup and site control. Now, anybody who could be exposed to a chemical spill or a hazardous waste spill must have what's called first responder awareness level training. That is training on how to recognize a risk and call for help. And that's all it is. Recognize the risk, call for help. If your employees have had hazardous materials training under the DOT, if they've had hazard communication training under OSHA, they have been taught how to recognize risks. You'll recognize them from reading the SDS, from looking at a label or a pictogram or a placard. If you know how to do this, how to recognize the risk and call for help, you've been trained at first responder awareness level. And the other levels, I don't see very often in trucking, someone who has to go to the higher levels. But if you wanted to be working at a cleanup site somewhere on the highway, you might need more training. If you're going to be a supervisor, you might need a higher level. If you're going to be the incident commander, you'll need a higher level. This could be 8 hours of training. It could be 24 hours. It could be up to 40 hours of training to deal with HAZWOPER. For us, typically in the trucking industry, when we've got trucks, we've got shops, everybody there should know how to recognize risk and how to get help. And that is HAZWOPER as we need it in the trucking industry. You notice here, there's no rule number. There's not a specific rule that says you have to do certain kinds of training to avoid slips, trips, and falls. There are individual rules in different parts of the standard. But slips, trips, and falls account for probably the most injuries in the workplace. And they're high frequency and they're high severity. A fall from elevation can involve serious injuries to where the person might not be able to work again. We certainly can have some minor injuries that are serious enough that the person can't come to work for a while. So we would recommend that you conduct training if you're using ladders, really formal, serious training on how to safely use ladders. For example, here in the Northwest, in Oregon and Washington, we have a lot of work being done in orchards, fruit trees everywhere, and we've got a lot of orchard work to do because we're providing a lot of the country with a lot of great fruit. Well, the orchard ladder is a little different than quite often a step ladder or some other kind of an extension ladder. If that is your business, you should be training on how to use that orchard ladder, and there are some steps to take. And speaking of steps, we have steps everywhere. We've got steps getting in and out of the truck. We have steps going up and down into our building. We also have uneven walking and working surfaces. Quite often our workspace where the trucks are parked, we'll have chuck holes, ridges, ditches, easy places to turn an ankle or to fall and maybe break a bone. So I think it's important, and you do this through your safety committee, walk the property. One of the requirements of the safety committee is quarterly to walk through the property and just do an inspection. What kinds of safety issues are out there? If you've got uneven walking and working surfaces, how can you correct that? Can you grade an uneven parking lot if it's dirt? Can you add gravel? Should you pave it? Look for the best way that you can solve that issue. You shouldn't be using broken ladders. Stairs should be in good order. There should be handrails. And we can provide quite a bit of information for you if you'd like to do training in that area, but you certainly should be, because this is a huge high-risk area for us. First aid and CPR. There's not a rule that says you have to have first aid CPR training everywhere at all times. The way the standard reads is if you don't have an infirmary or a clinic or a hospital in close proximity near your workplace where you can get someone in a hurry if they're injured, then you need to have someone on site who's trained in first aid and CPR, adult first aid and CPR. If there are children in the area, for example, if you're involved somehow where there are small children around, maybe employees' children, then you should also have the infant CPR training. First aid and CPR, if there's no easy way to get someone to medical help, then you need to have trained people on site. And they should be trained, retrained every 2 years. The American Red Cross has a lot of material. There are private firms that provide the training, and you may want to develop a certified trainer in your own workforce that can do this. Okay, that covers the Department of Labor. We've covered the Department of Transportation, and then there's one item left that we want to talk about, and that's the safe transportation of food. This training now is required by the Food Safety Management Act. That was an act of Congress. Remember, we talked about how laws are made. A bill was introduced. It went through the committees. Congress voted on it. The president signed it, and we had an act of Congress, the Food Safety Management Act. They oversee the the Department of Agriculture oversees the Food and Drug Administration, and the Food and Drug Administration has the authority under Title 21 to publish rules for training. So the rule is in this part. If you were to look for it, it would be 1 CFR, and then we'd look at part 1.900 to 1.934. Training requirement applies to shippers, loaders, transporters, and receivers of food that must be refrigerated or frozen in transit. Now, this is food that's sensitive to temperature. You might have sodas, for example, that are packaged and should be refrigerated to drink, but they don't have to be refrigerated simply to transport. So if you're subject to this, and it all has to do with maintaining temperature in a refrigerated or frozen load. So there's a lot of record keeping involved, and it always has to be between the shipper and any transporter that's going to transport refrigerated food. The shipper lays out in writing the agreement and the instructions. The transporter must follow those instructions, and they have records to keep. They have to monitor the temperature of the food product all the way to the destination. Some of the topics you'll have to cover are trailer cleaning, maintenance of the temperature in transit, and record keeping. So that's the sanitary transportation of food in a nutshell. And again, with all of these things that we've talked about this afternoon, there is more material available if you decide that you need to accomplish this training and you don't have the training material, or you need someone to come in and do the training for you. You should certainly contact Glowstone, and we'll certainly try and help you wherever you might need it. So that covers the material that we had hoped to share with you today. And at this point, if there are questions, I believe we may be able to take some questions right now. I'm not sure how this part works. So
yeah, so thank you, John, again, for just walking us through all of these required trainings. I know it's just a brief overview of the required trainings, but many of you guys might have a company that has a trucking fleet or a fleet of trucks that has, whether it's construction, manufacturing, distribution, transportation, that might need, if not all of them, at least many of these trainings. I think John covered about 17 requirements in his presentation, and it's a very valuable time to ask and pick his brain. If you guys have any questions, please write it in the chat box. We're gonna give you about a minute or two to write some questions down, pick John's brain. He's very, very knowledgeable on this topic, and we'll do our best to answer your questions. I'll give you about a minute or two to do this, so please stick around. While we wait for your comments or questions, I do want to mention here at Glowstone, we do a plethora of training here at Glowstone, from our web-based managed training program, where we have almost all of these training requirements under one roof. They're all available 24/7 online. If it's something where you just need one-time access to required training, we can do it one time. If it's something where you want to do a monthly training series for your drivers to management, we can get a program scheduled specifically for your company, your needs, your industry, whatever it is. Our library, we help document the training that it's been done. We provide the step-by-step process for you and your drivers through the training program, and it's available 24/7 wherever your drivers may be across the U.S. if that's the case. And all you need is a computer and audio and internet connection to do it. Also, beyond just the managed training, we do have specific training that we offer online, or classroom training specifically here in Oregon, since that's where we're based out of. We have the Oregon Distracted Driver Avoidance course. Thank you, John, for helping us work with this, putting this training together. This was originally specifically for the, using your phone or using a electronic device while you're driving and getting caught. You can reduce your fee or prevent your fee for the first time that you got caught for say, using your phone while driving here in Oregon. But this training, whether it's preventative, trying to prevent your drivers from doing this, or if you're out of Oregon in another state, these rules are coming, and so this is just a great, again, training that covers all of that information. best practices, distracted driving, etc. And we provide, as you can see the list here, many of the other training topics. You can go to glowsun.com, rules of the road training to look around and see what we offer. Again, I will mention, I see some questions popping up about how do we get a copy of this. I will send out all of the slides in an email tomorrow, as well as the physical or a link to the recording of this webinar. So that will be sent out tomorrow morning. Those were the two questions. So unless there's any other questions, I'll go ahead and wrap up this presentation. But yes, we'll thank you guys all for joining us. I know there's many others that didn't attend today that I'll shoot out information to as well. And please join us next week or next month. We do these monthly. If you're specifically in the trucking or regulatory questions, we cover lots of topics. We started this in 2017, so we've got almost 20 webinars that we've done in the past. So go check out the ones in the past online, register for the next month if you haven't already, and stay tuned for what's coming up for the rest of the year. With that, thank you all for joining us, and we conclude this webinar.